Imagine this. You're walking through a peaceful medieval village, stone cottages, market stalls, church bells in the distance. It almost seems charming, until a sour, burning stench hits your nose so hard you nearly gag. You look around. No sewage ditch. No rotting food. No dead animal, and then you see it. Men standing barefoot in large wooden vats, stomping in warm, yellow liquid. Not water. Human urine. They're not being punished. They're not prisoners. They're workers. This is their job. And here's the part that will stay in your mind long after this video ends. Everything from the king's robes to the knight's cloaks to the church's holy banners passed through this very mixture. Your favorite medieval costume drama? Every soft fabric in it was once soaked in someone's bladder. Tonight, we're diving into one of the worst but most important jobs in history. The fuller, the man paid to wash wool with human waste. Because without him, medieval society would have been cold, naked, and very unfashionable. Chapter 1. Wool, water, and waste. Why medieval Europe relied on pea-soaked cloth. If you were a medieval European, your entire life, from birth to burial, would be surrounded by wool. It was in your bedding, your cloak, your tunic, your hat, even the padded lining of your armor if you were fortunate or unfortunate enough to wear any. Wool was not just a material. It was an all-encompassing environment. But wool, fresh from the sheep, is not soft or clean or cozy. It is greasy, sticky, and heavy with lanolin, natural oils, and dirt pressed deep into the fibers to turn raw fleece into wearable cloth. Something, or rather, someone had to clean it. This someone was called a fuller. Today, if you want a clean fabric, you toss it into a washing machine, press a button, and watch scented chemicals do the work. A medieval fuller had no such luxury. Instead of lemon-scented detergent and softener beads, the fuller's cleaning agent was human urine, collected in buckets from neighbors' inns, and designated piss pots on street corners. Urine was the single most important industrial chemical in medieval textile production. And strangely enough, it worked why pee was the perfect detergent. To understand why European towns were full of paid pee collectors and industrial vats of fermented urine, you have to know a bit about chemistry, something medieval people understood indirectly through observation. When urine ferments, it releases ammonia, a powerful alkali capable of loosening grease and softening fibers. Modern detergents work largely on the same principle. Medieval fullers didn't know what ammonia was, but they knew that weeks-old pee, left to sour in the heat, cleaned wool like nothing else. So they didn't just accept it, they industrialized it. Cities like London, Paris, Florence, and York had public collection points where residents could donate their urine for small payment or tax forgiveness. In some cities, households were legally obligated to hand over full chamber pots to assigned collectors. Imagine this: a cold stone street at dawn, a man dragging a wooden cart, knocking on doors with a polite but weary voice. Morning collection. And housewives bringing out their brimming jugs of overnight waste. The wealthiest households produced the best product. Even the urine of monasteries was prized. Monks had famously controlled diets, producing cleaner, more consistent chemical content. The urine was then transported to the fulling mills, poured into great stone vats, and left to ferment further until it became powerful enough to burn your eyes just being near it. And then, the real work began, the fulling process, standing in warm urine for hours. Before mechanical stampers were invented, most fullers did the job with their bare legs. Picture a muscular man, tunic lifted above the knees, standing waist-deep in a vat of warm, frothing urine, stomping rhythmically on woolen cloth beneath his feet. He pressed, he twisted, he hopped. He massaged the fabric until the oil loosened, and the fibers tightened. Hours, not minutes. Fullers did this day after day, working in large open structures by rivers. where wind would blow the stench toward unlucky villagers. Not surprisingly, fullers were typically located downwind of town centers, zoned like medieval industrial waste plants. And yet, they were essential. No fuller meant no clean fabric. No clean fabric meant poorly dressed citizens. Poorly dressed citizens meant shame, poverty, and disease. So while everyone avoided standing near a fuller, everyone needed them. Fullers were paid well, but still treated poorly. Medieval society had a peculiar way of treating essential but disgusting professions. Gong farmers who shoveled latrines, executioners who disposed of bodies, and fullers all shared this dual status, technically respected by law. They were protected from harassment and sometimes granted high wages due to the misery of their labor, socially avoided by neighbors. No one wanted to sit next to them in church or marry into their families. A successful fuller could earn more than many craftsmen, especially in booming textile regions like Flanders, Florence, and Lancashire, where fine wool funded entire economies. Some fullers even unionized early, banding together to set price standards, one of the earliest forms of wage negotiation in labor history. But no amount of money could erase the smell. Medieval accounts mention that fullers were recognizable by scent alone, long before you saw them. The odor embedded itself in their hair, in their skin, in everything they touched. Even washing afterward rarely helped, because they had to use water drawn from the same rivers contaminated by their vats. Imagine trying to cleanse yourself of filth and filth. The introduction of fulling mills, relief or more misery. By the 13th century, fullers began installing water-powered wooden hammers, sometimes called stocks or walk mills. These contraptions repeatedly beat the wool in troughs filled with urine and dirt, replacing the need for workers to stand inside the vats themselves. This mechanization had two effects. It improved efficiency. More cloth, less labor. It shifted the fuller's duties from stomping to maintaining heavy machinery. Now instead of soaked legs, they had splintered hands, crushed fingers, and deafening noise. Listening to constant thudding all day in echoing mills could induce headaches so intense that some fullers stuffed wool into their ears as makeshift earplugs. Some historians argue that early fulling mills were among the first proto-factories in Europe, long before the Industrial Revolution, and that the humble fuller was a precursor to the factory worker. Even progress, it seems, does not eliminate suffering. It simply changes its form, a profession hidden in plain sight. Perhaps the strangest legacy of the fullers is how visible yet invisible they were. They left no monuments, no poetry, no epics. Yet every medieval painting of a noble or knight wearing crisp garments owes credit to them. Their work seeped silently into culture. The surname Fuller, Walker, or Tucker in English-speaking countries come directly from the trade. Streets named Tenter Lane, Fuller's Row, or Pisbrook Street were once centers of textile processing. Even medieval guilds, early forms of political bodies, often placed fullers at the base, powerful. Yet never glamorous, they dealt not in honor, but in utility. They did not fight wars, but they dressed those who did. They were not celebrated, they were tolerated. And yet, there is something humbling, almost inspiring, in realizing that civilization marched forward not by glory alone, but by workers willing to stand in things no one else would. Which leads to the question, did the fullers ever protest their condition, or did they quietly accept it as their fate? Chapter 2. Standing barefoot in warm urine for hours, tools of the trade. If you could travel back to a medieval textile town, say Florence, Ghent, or York, your nose would find the fuller before your eyes did. Fulling houses were usually built downwind, placed near rivers and sewers where the smell would be someone else's problem. But sometimes when the wind changed, even respectable citizens were forced to confront the truth. Their fine woolen tunics were born in stench. Inside one of these workshops you would see large open vats, often carved from stone or made from thick wooden planks sealed with pitch. These vats were not filled with water, but with standing urine, often warmed by sunlight or, in colder regions, heated over embers to activate the ammonia. The smell thickened in the air like steam from a bathhouse, except no one left this place feeling refreshed. And then there were the men, the foolers themselves. They did not sit. They did not scrub. They stomped the human washing machine. Before the invention of mechanical stampers, foolers cleaned cloth by standing barefoot in the vats and treading on woolen fabric continuously for hours. Their movements were not random. They followed rhythmic patterns, almost like dancing in slow motion. Press with the heel, twist with the ball of the foot. Lift, stomp, rotate. This motion forced the ammonia-rich liquid deep into the fibers, softening and tightening the weave. It wasn't about cleaning in the modern sense. It was more like controlled felting, binding the wool into a dense, durable material. The temperature of the vat varied by season, but in many accounts, foolers preferred it warm. Warm urine reacted faster, though few argued that standing in tepid, half-rotten fluid was a pleasant experience. Some foolers even sweated visibly from the fumes alone, adding another layer of bodily contribution to the mixed clothing. Optional, you may wonder, did foolers wear anything while stomping in these vats? Historical illustrations suggest many worked with their tunics hiked above the waist or stripped entirely down to undergarments. Not for comfort, but for practicality. Wool absorbs liquid quickly, and once soaked in urine, it was nearly impossible to rinse out. A fooler's best clothing was often his least absorbent skin. One medieval satirist remarked that you could tell a fooler by the scars on his legs, not from blades, but from chemical burns. The ammonia in urine, especially when heavily fermented, could blister skin. Foolers commonly wrapped their shins in oilcloth or even animal intestines to protect themselves, early forms of waterproofing. So while knights donned iron armor and soldiers wore chainmail, the fooler's battlefield protection was pig gut and vinegar-soaked linen. Tools of the trade, contrary to what one might expect. The fooler's essential toolkit was remarkably simple. Tool and purpose, urine vats, main workstations, often large enough to hold 2 men, and several layers of cloth, stirring poles. Wooden rods used to push and reposition fabric in deeper vats, tenterhooks. Hooks used to stretch the fabric afterward to maintain shape, giving rise to the phrase on tenterhooks. Fuller's earth clay. In some regions, a fine clay substance was mixed with urine for extra cleaning power. Stamping hammers, later period. Water-powered wooden hammers that replaced human feet in more advanced workshops. Despite their crude appearance, these tools were part of a highly coordinated industrial process. Wool was incredibly valuable. Raw fleece could be worth more than silver in certain markets, so fullers were expected to work carefully. Damaging a batch of cloth could mean financial ruin for an entire merchant household. Pain, practice, and pride, surprisingly. Many foolers defended their profession, while outsiders viewed them as filthy. Foolers considered themselves craftsmen, not laborers. They argued that anyone could shear a sheep or boil dye, but only an experienced fooler could judge the perfect moment, when cloth had reached full density. Too much stomping, and the fabric became stiff. Too little, and it remained greasy. Some foolers could identify fabric quality by sound alone, listening to how it squelched beneath their feet. Others prided themselves on leaving no crease, no fold, no inconsistency in their finished product. Medieval guild records reveal foolers often swore oaths to protect trade secrets. Some refused to teach new apprentices until they had proved they could tolerate the stench without complaint. Complaining, it seems, was a luxury they could not afford. How long could a fooler work? Working conditions depended on local rules and daylight. But most foolers toiled from sunrise until afternoon, sometimes 6 hours straight in the vat, stepping only occasionally onto a ledge to stretch their aching legs. Imagine stomping grapes for wine, except instead of fragrant fruit, you're crushing wool beneath sour brine made of human waste. And instead of celebration at the end, you go home smelling like you've been swimming in disaster. There were no gloves, no boots, no wash stations. A fooler quite literally walked home in the proof of his service, which raises an important question. What happened when the fooler couldn't stand in the vat anymore? Chapter 3. The Rise of Industrial Cloth and the Fall of the Fooler. For thousands of years, from ancient Mesopotamia to medieval England, the fooler stood as an essential if unfortunate figure in the textile world. Every robe, tunic, cloak or banner worn by soldier, peasant, or king passed through their hands, or rather, through their feet. To think that empires were draped in fabric softened by human urine seems like an inconvenient truth history would rather not dwell on. But history, like wool, is seldom soft without effort. Yet even the most indispensable jobs face extinction, and for the foolers of Europe, the beginning of the end would not be a riot or a revolt, but a machine simple in form, deafening in consequence. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, change was brewing, not in vats of ammonia-laced cloth, but in the quiet rise of mechanization. Water wheels, once used to grind grain and press olives, were soon applied to textile treatment. Instead of men stomping on damp wool, great wooden hammers known as fulling stocks began pounding cloth with rhythmic strikes. No soaking feet, no skin irritations, no stench. A single water-powered mill could do in minutes what took several men-hours of soaking and pressing. Wool that once needed to be massaged by human limbs could now be placed under relentless beams of mechanical wood. The first foolers to witness these machines might have felt the unease of a craftsman watching his hands become obsolete. A vat worker could be replaced by a paddle. Generations of inherited technique reduced to lever and gear. Some foolers resisted. In towns such as Leeds, Ghent, and Florence, petitions were filed urging guild masters to ban or limit mechanized fulling. They argued that machine-hardened cloth was inferior, that true wool needed the sensitivity of feet to sense when it was properly compacted. But the merchants were not sentimental. Merchants rarely are. Faster production meant lower costs. Lower costs meant better profits. And profit has always spoken more loudly than tradition. The decline of the manual fooler was not sudden. Across Europe, rural villages continued stomping well into the 18th century, long after city mills had mechanized the process. In remote Scottish towns, travelers into the 1800s reported seeing men knee-deep in tubs of stale urine, humming as they pressed wool between their toes. The past is never as distant as we imagine, but technology, once embraced, rarely retreats. As fulling mills spread across riverbanks in England, France, and the Low Countries, the role of the fooler began to fragment. Some adapted, transitioning into machine operators, trading the sensation of soaked cloth under their feet for the roar of wooden levers and grinding shafts. Others became transporters, hauling bundles of raw wool to mills instead of processing it themselves. A few, unable to find a place in the new system, disappeared into other obscure trades, perhaps becoming dung collectors, bone burners, or night soil men. The medieval world offered no shortage of filthy professions. Urine, too, began to lose its throne. By the 19th century, chemists experimenting with ammonia discovered ways to synthesize it. Why rely on inconsistent human donations when laboratory purity could be guaranteed? The fooler's ancient ally had been replaced by bottled chemicals, processed and standardized. The pungent scent of the streets, the tavern slop, the night jar, the public trough, was no longer needed in fabric making. The fooler's legacy, so deeply tied to the biology of the human bladder, vanished beneath polished brass faucets. Yet even in disappearance, remnants lingered. The word fooler found refuge in surnames: Fuller, Tucker, Walker, echoes of men who once trod wool beneath their feet. Entire English towns bore names like Fulling Mill or Tucker's Row, silent monuments to forgotten labor. In some regions, old fulling vats were repurposed into baptismal pools or animal troughs, unaware of the long history of flesh and fiber they had endured. And one final irony, even as the profession vanished from necessity, its sensory memory endured in language. The phrase "fuller's earth," once referring to clay used in purification, became a cosmetic product. Women in the Victorian era applied it to their faces to absorb excess oils, never suspecting that the name of their powder came from an occupation that once involved soaking wool in human waste. The last true foolers likely never realized they were the last. There was no farewell banquet, no banner raised in their honor. No poet penned laments for the men of the vats. They simply stepped out of the tubs one final time, perhaps warming their aching feet by a fire, unaware that history had already moved past them. Yet consider this, in a world where people today recoil at even minor inconvenience, where touching wet food in a sink is enough to elicit disgust. How remarkable that entire civilizations were clothed by men who willingly bathed in ammonia for hours at a time. How many soft cloaks worn by knights? How many rich tapestries hung in castles? How many carefully tailored robes worn by royalty were softened not by silk or magic, but by the stubborn endurance of those who dipped their legs into what others could not bear to smell? So as modern life surrounds you with effortless comfort fabric softeners, laundromats, chemically treated cotton, ask yourself, would you have stood in their place? Would you have fed your livelihood with your own body's waste? Would you have stomped and endured for a trade that earned little praise and no glory? Or perhaps, more unsettlingly, how many forgotten professions today are quietly disappearing beneath automation, destined to be remembered only in surnames and obscure footnotes? If the fooler could vanish so completely, what of us? And if you're still awake after all that medieval misery, well, congratulations, but if you're drifting off already, that's even better. That means I've done my job before you go. Whether you're tucked in bed or slowly dissolving into your pillow, please take a moment to tap like it helps more. Sleepy wanderers find their way here, and if you'd like more quietly unsettling history to fall asleep to, subscribe to Quiet Boring Sleep so I can keep whispering strange facts into your dreams. Thank you for spending your night with me. Sleep well. And remember, someone once stood in warm urine so your blanket could be soft. Good night.